Adab, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture in our series Islam After Colonialism. I'm Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Liberal Studies at Habib University, which will soon be called the Department of Humanities and Comparative Inquiry, also very relevant to our talk today. This time, our partner, Professor Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter, as you must have seen on the poster for this lecture at the Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies. We are co-sponsoring this series, co-participating in it. He won't be able to be with us. But allow me to say something once again briefly about this series and why we felt that this was important, and it actually corresponds to a great deal of work that is emerging precisely right now and has been emerging over the past couple of decades. Well, first of all, historically, obviously, it's to get a measure of where we are and how we got here. Yeah, this is something that is on everybody's mind, as is always the case during moments of crisis. And if our age is anything, it's an age of crises, sort of compounding crises. Yeah, there are many of them. So to get a measure of where we are and how we got here, and that's essentially a modern question. Yeah, precisely because modernity is an age of tremendous historical transformation. Yeah, radical transformation like nothing that humanity had ever seen before. So this radical transformation, of course, we now know, thanks to the discourse on the Anthropocene, is unique in human history in terms of our relationship with nature and in terms of the ecology, etc. But of course, that corresponds to a dramatic transformation in how we live, how we think, and it would not have been possible without that. So what are these transformations that have happened? But of course, any after, so this series is called Islam After Colonialism, any after necessarily implies a before. Yeah. What is that before that one is talking about when we talk about Islam after colonialism? That's a really difficult issue for us today, even though we cannot avoid a reference to the past. All of us are involved because the past is not an idea. It doesn't simply disappear. All of us necessarily all the time make references to the past. Nationalism certainly cannot do without accounting for itself in some kind of grand historical narrative. Yeah. That the past is very much present in our lives. And yet we know precisely because of this extraordinary transformation that has taken place, and also because of the particular nature of that transformation under colonialism, that we are deprived of the very resources to be able to make sense of that past. So that reference, how are we? So that is the reparative part, or the restorative part, the reparative part of any kind of post-colonial project. And that's post-colonial is not just for us; it's for the world. Yeah. So it's the post-coloniality is very much a part of modernity. It's not something that's outside of modernity. With that said, there could be nobody that I'm aware of really who could help us precisely in this task that I've been saying that we are so dramatically in need of, but really are deprived of the resources precisely because of our colonial past, as well as hooked up with that, our nationalist past. I could think of nobody better really to help us with that project than Professor Shankar Nair. Really, it's a privilege and an honor to introduce him. I really admire, despite the fact that he's very young, really admire his work and all that he's managed to already accomplish. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, and he got all of his degrees from Harvard, BA, MA, PhD. His research interests are in Sufism and Islamic philosophy, Quranic exegesis, Hindu philosophy and theology, Muslim-Hindu Interaction in South Asia. He is the author of this marvelous book, which you can download for free from the University of California Press website in their Luminosa initiative, where they provide freely downloadable PDFs. The book is called Translating Wisdom, Hindu-Muslim Interactions, Hindu-Muslim Intellectual Interactions. This is another thing that's very lacking for us, and we really need to learn more about, is our own intellectual history from this past. Hindu-Muslim Intellectual Interactions in Early Modern South Asia. The talk, what you've seen, the title of the talk that you've seen on the poster for the talk is Muslim-Hindu Interactions as a Source of Theory. Professor Shankar's own title was longer, and I'll tell you that now because it's so perfect for this series. It says Pre-Colonial Possibilities for the Post-Colonial. So that's the first part of his really exciting title, Pre-Colonial Possibilities for the Post-Colonial, Muslim-Hindu Interactions as a Source of Theory. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Shankar Nair to enlighten us with his thoughts on this essential question.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi, for a too kind introduction. I appreciate it very much, and appreciate the invitation very much. This book that you mentioned, thank you for mentioning it, and my gratitude to University of California Press for making it freely downloadable. It was precisely my intention to try to make the book available to South Asia, to South Asians, to the broader Muslim world in ways that expensive American academic publications usually aren't. And in an age of COVID, this is really my first opportunity to try to bring the book into wider conversations outside of my little niche in the North American ivory tower. So I hope we have a good conversation today, and I do appreciate it. And I do mean it. I'm aiming for more of a conversation rather than a presentation or lecture. I'll offer one little just historical nugget, a historical bit of text pulled from the book, and I'll sort of give an exegesis of it. But I'm hoping that'll just become an excuse to launch into a conversation, as the first part of my title suggested, Pre-Colonial Possibilities for the Post-Colonial. I'll try to offer a kind of reconstruction of one little piece of pre-modern text, and then I'd like to think with all of you out there for how we can try to harness this text, think with this text, use this kind of text in our own thinking for navigating the modern, the contemporary, the post-colonial. Let me start a little bit by just giving a sort of quick glimpse at the state of the study of pre-modern South Asian Islam in the field, the discipline of religious studies. I'm speaking primarily from a North American context. I wish Professor Rizvi were here to speak more to the European, UK context. But I'm aware that, of course, the conversations and the possibility of conversation is much different in South Asia. So I'm hoping to think productively with these other discourses. So in terms of the sort of contemporary study of South Asian, pre-modern South Asian Islam in the academy, it is, I would say, overwhelmingly invested in providing correctives to the sorts of nationalist narratives and nationalist historiography that Professor Naqvi was just gesturing to. In nationalist historiography, nationalist narratives, Hinduism and Islam are these discrete, essentialized realities that are sort of fundamentally and eternally opposed to one another, fundamentally hostile. Nearly all of Indo-Islamic history is explained in terms of this dichotomy. You'll frequently find a nationalist narrative of sort of two factions within the South Asian Islamic world. When I say Indian, by the way, I'm using it in a pre-modern sense of Hind, what we would now call South Asia. Right, so there's frequently a story of two factions. One faction that represents tolerance, liberalism, pluralism. The usual go-to historical characters are Akbar or Dara Shikoh. That's one faction. And they're sort of eternally at war with this other faction, a faction of bigotry, intolerance, orthodoxy. The words chosen depends on sort of the agenda and the political orientation of the scholar who's describing said individual. Aurangzeb is, of course, the usual go-to character for that side of the story. And these two factions are often in a fairly transparent way, more or less stand-ins for a secular India. It's up for debate if it remains secular to this day, but a secular India versus an Islamic Pakistan. And so it sort of tells the whole story right there. These nationalist narratives are deeply refracted through a colonial legacy. The conceptualization, even the phrase Orthodox Islam, right, it's refracted through that colonial lens. It carries with it an assumption that Islam is this essentially dry, legalistic, zealous, intolerant, bloodthirsty religion. Islam isn't naturally philosophical or rational or mystical or tolerant. Modern scholars are deeply invested in providing correctives to these nationalist stories and are trying to highlight the problem of projecting modern categories and modern realities back into the pre-modern past, the problem of reading the medieval through the lens of our contemporary situation. The correctives that modern scholarship tries to provide, to be brief in an extreme way, I'm definitely making simplifications here, but effectively, if the nationalist narratives attempt to explain everything in terms of religion, and again, a problematic colonized notion of religion, if the nationalist narratives try to explain all of history through that lens, the response from contemporary academics tries to marginalize religion more often than not. Rather than trying to think through essentialized religious categories, contemporary academic scholarship tries to emphasize the way that religious identities are processes that are shaped in history, right? And there's now a turn to focus on the political, the social, the everyday quotidian as shaping the dynamics of what we have habitually thought about in terms of Hindu-Muslim interactions. Right? They want to pose the question, maybe religion actually has very little to do with it, right? When the first Bengali Muslims who were writing in Bengali, in the vernacular Bengali, there was a massive deployment of what we would call Hindu Sanskritic vocabulary, right? Cosmological terms, theological terms, terms to describe God and the cosmos that come from the Sanskrit Hindu tradition. Nationalist historiography would tend to call this some kind of appropriation of Hinduism or a moment of Hindu-Muslim encounter. Modern scholarship is going to try to say, maybe religion doesn't actually have all that much to do with it. Maybe these are just everyday Bengali Muslims who are trying to find a way to talk about Islam in their mother tongue. Simple as that. Not a grand meeting of theologies, but something akin to a born and raised American Muslim or Canadian Muslim, what have you, wants to talk about Allah in English. They're going to use the word God. Simple as that, right? They're just choosing the nearest proximate equivalent. And yes, there's a big Judeo-Christian baggage there that they would want to distance themselves from, but they're using the best term available. So again, not some kind of meeting of essentialized religious categories, but rather a very everyday process that doesn't have actually a whole lot to do with theology or religion or something like that. Another grand mode of corrective is to emphasize the political. And really here we're talking about the Mughals, we're talking about imperial motivations, politics and sort of ideology. So I'm going to talk today about one instance of a translation, right? We know that the Mughals patronized, starting with Akbar, invested a great deal of energy and resources into translating a large body of Hindu Sanskrit texts into Persian. And again, nationalist historiography would think about this in terms of those dichotomies, Akbar versus Aurangzeb, Dara Shikoh versus Aurangzeb. Modern scholarship is going to try to correct that narrative and say, really what's going on here is an attempt at some kind of political imperial act, right? Akbar, Darshakov, Shah Jahan, whoever, they're patronizing these translations to legitimize the empire to their subjects, right? The overwhelming majority of the population that the Mughals were ruling over were non-Muslims, right? Translating their text into Persian, showing their people that your heritage, your texts, your scriptures, what have you, is part of who we are as Mughals. It's a move to justify Mughal rulership to broader South Asia, non-Muslim South Asia. That's sort of one grand way of trying to re-envision what motivates the project. Another kind of corrective is to say that there is a project here of what we could call a mirror for princes genre, sort of Mughal royal political self-fashioning. Right? There's a long legacy of Arabic texts, of Persian texts, that long predates the Mughals, for instance, writing a sort of mirror for princes genre, the sorts of virtues and characteristics and qualities that a good king or a good prince should have, right? Another corrective will say, the Mughals were choosing for translation texts, Indic texts, South Asian texts, that were part of this same kind of genre, right? So translating stories of Rama, translating stories of other princes and other heroes, looking for models of how to fashion oneself into a good South Asian king, kind of Mughal royal self-fashion. So my intervention is to say that this modern scholarship, to my view, has provided really very important correctives to nationalist historiography. Don't get me wrong, I infinitely prefer what these scholars are saying to anything that's come out of sort of the typical nationalist narratives. But I wonder if the pendulum has swung too far to the other direction. There's been such a concern with marginalizing religion, however conceived, that it's become too absent from the ways that we tell the history of the pre-modern period. Let's try to bring religion back into the picture somehow. Modern scholars usually only in passing seem to address some kind of an Islamic religious quest for what we might call philosophical or theological truth, a goal of salvation or liberation. It's really marginal to the way that these contemporary academics tend to analyze this time period. But I think a great many pre-modern South Asian Muslim actors took these very notions very seriously, right? A kind of theological search for truth, a goal of salvation. This is part of what motivates them to say what they say, to write what they write, etc. So let's try to give some voice to that in our own scholarship. And I will thus pull up a quick PowerPoint here so we can take a look at the text at hand. So I hope you all can see that. Okay, so as I mentioned, during the height of the Mughal Empire in South Asia, roughly 16th to 17th centuries, Common Era, Muslim nobles patronized and facilitated the translation of numerous Hindu Sanskrit texts into the Persian language. A number of Sanskrit texts were chosen for translation, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, especially the Bhagavad Gita, the Atharva Veda, various Upanishads, the Bhagavata Purana, the list goes on and on. Typically, these translations were accomplished by teams of Persian-speaking Muslim court scholars on the one hand, and Sanskrit pundits on the other. The Sanskrit pundits often hailing from such great centers of Sanskrit learning as Benares. So today I want to turn our attention to one particular site of Mughal translation, namely the 1597 Persian rendition of the Sanskrit Laghu Yoga Vasishta. This was a very, very popular text in early modern Hindu South Asia. The Muslims too, the Mughals too, were deeply, deeply fascinated with this text. The Mughals, both the Mughal court and just generally during Mughal times, this text had been translated, reimagined, re-envisioned. It became the inspiration for sort of Muslim retellings numerous times. We have 10 or 11 complete or partial translations of this Sanskrit text into Persian, not to mention the wide plethora of Muslim compositions that were somehow inspired by the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. I'm just going to refer to this text as the Laghu for the rest of today. Just a little bit important for you to get the history of this text clear for you to be able to follow my presentation. So the original Sanskrit text is called the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. It was composed by one Gauda Abhinanda, sometime between the 19th and 13th century. It's difficult to date the text. The Laghu is itself already a retelling of a larger text known as the Mokshopaya. There were a number of Sanskrit commentaries. Here I'm just naming one of them by Atmasukha. And then finally here, this is the text I'll be looking at directly, a complete Persian translation, in fact, one of the first Persian translations, which was called the Jug Vasisht, simply the sort of Persianized transliteration of Yoga Vasishta. This translation was composed by a Persian-speaking, a Persian Muslim court scholar, Nizamuddin Panipati, in collaboration with two Sanskrit Pandits, Jagannatha Mishra Banarasi and Patan Mishra Jajipuri. And again, as I mentioned, it was completed in 1597, patronized by Salim, Prince Salim, who would go on to become Emperor Jahangir a few years later. So I'll focus my attention today on just the introductory passages from this Persian Jug Vasisht, where we see some of the basic terms and the overall spirit of the translation come across most explicitly. So in order to make this translation work, Nizamuddin Panipati had to stretch and bend the Persian language in such a way that it could accept an influx of a tremendous volume of new vocabulary, whose roots lay in a very foreign source, namely Sanskrit and its literary and conceptual worlds. As a result, nearly every page of the Persian Jug Vasisht contains numerous Sanskrit terms transliterated into Persian, relevant to an extremely wide range of topics, right? Hindu terms, Sanskrit terms like puja, deities like Vishnu, Shastra, Tirtha, Tapasya, Dhyana, Varna, Janma, right? Many terms appearing again in transliteration throughout the treatise, peppering nearly every page of the text. The three translators working together had to find some way to make each of these Sanskrit terms, these Hindu terms, comprehensible to a Persian reader. They would do this often by means of a simple single or multiple word definition, right? Or sometimes they would resort to illustrative analogies or metaphors. These metaphors would be borrowed sometimes from the Quran. They might be borrowed from the long tradition of Persian Sufi poetry. Sometimes they would use metaphors from the Laghu Yoga Vasishta itself, right? To try to find some way to explain these Hindu Sanskrit terms in a kind of Persianate Islamic language. So we have, just to give a few examples, routinely a Sanskrit Hindu word like Brahman, right, referring to absolute reality, would be translated sometimes as Allah, right? Seems a natural choice, or sometimes in a slightly more philosophical register, wujude mutlaq, right? Absolute being. So let's now turn to just a few paragraphs from the introductory portions of this translation to try to get a sense of how the translators, and really Panipati in particular, show what they're up to in this Persian translation of the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. So here's the first passage, which comes actually from Panipati's introduction to the text, where he describes the Laghu Yoga Vasishta as Sufism. Right? He's happy to call the Laghu Yoga Vasishta tasawwuf. Right? He also refers to it as a, quote, commentary upon realities, sharh-e haqa'iq. Panipati then proceeds to introduce readers to what he calls the religious path of the Brahmins. Right, so let's, just to read it. The Brahmins of India possess the religious path, madhab, of the ancient sages, concerning the oneness of the essence of the real, may he be praised and exalted, and concerning the attributes of his perfection, the levels of his descents into the world, the origin of multiplicity, and the manifestation of the worlds. If any distinction should obtain between the Brahmins and the ancient sages, it would only be with respect to terminology, istilah, and language, zaban. The phrase ancient sages here, this is most directly a reference to the tradition of ancient Greek philosophy. Right? Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, Neoplatonism, of course, a heritage that had long ago been translated into Arabic and imported into the Muslim world, right? Famously the Greek, Greco-Arabic or Greek to Arabic translation movement during the Abbasid Empire. It should be noted that there, like the word philosophy or the Greek philosophers to our sort of modern imagination, this is philosophy that has little to do with religion. That's usually the way that we think about it nowadays. In the eyes of someone like Panipati, the eyes of the Islamic tradition at this time, this Greek heritage, Greek philosophical heritage would have been deeply rooted in a phenomenon like revelation or scripture, right? Hermes, the prophet Hermes Idris, is thought to be the sort of founding prophet of this Greek philosophical heritage. We see also in this passage a clear and abundant use of the technical vocabulary that comes from the Sufi tradition known as Wahdat al-Wujud, the tradition associated with the likes of Ibn Arabi. We see a doctrine of manifestation or divine self-disclosure, tajalli, right, peidai, in which the divine, the real, manifests itself in the form of the world by means of or through its divine names and attributes. We have the issue here of language, zaban, or terminology, istilah. From our modern eyes, and a number of modern scholars have cast it this way, we could read this line here, right? Any difference between the Brahmins and the sort of ancient sages, it's just a difference of language. They're really saying the same thing. To modernize this might look like a kind of a simple ignoring of differences, like brushing differences under the rug in a way that might strike us as problematic. What I would argue, however, is that, and we'll see Panipati do this, Panipati wants to root this idea of language in the Quranic affirmation of God having sent multiple revelations to different messengers in different languages. Right? We know what the Quran says. Each of these messengers brought the same truth. Right? The Quran tells us that each of these prophets, the revelation they brought, confirms one another, confirms one and the same truth. So we have a Quranic and an Islamic idea here, robustly and sophisticatedly thought about, where the one truth really, a single truth really can be expressed in different languages, even though these languages really are different at their own level. The passage continues. The Kashmiri Pandit Abhinanda, who is the author of the text of the Yoga Vasishta, the Jog Vasishta, at the commencement of this abridgment, leads off with the name of God and praises for the Creator Most High. It should be known that the names of the real, Nam Ha Yahak, Most High, have no end or limit. Every one of the great rishis, sages, and the seekers of the real have chosen one of his names, which are in accordance with the avatars and are the manifestations of the levels of his self-disclosure. Those rishis and seekers remember their chosen name much. They seek by means of that name a generous emanation, phase, from him who is the origin of all emanation. The modes of the avatara are laid out in the revered books of the people of India. India, again, is the word Hind. So Panipati here references the notion of the Quranic names and attributes of God, right? The 99 names and attributes of God, Asma, Sifat. This is probably familiar to most of you, but just to sort of spell it out, basing themselves upon a well-known hadith in which the Prophet speaks of God's 99 names, Sufi thinkers have often looked to the names and adjectives by which God describes himself in the Quran as a window into understanding or articulating God's divine nature, the nature of the real. While some interpreters have strived to restrict any valid description of God to the specific names and attributes with which God is described in the Quran, other interpreters, Ibn Arabi included, have insisted that the number of the divine names could actually be infinite. This latter interpretation is clearly the one that Panipati is favoring here, like saying the names of the real have no end or limit. By saying the divine names could be infinite, space is thus created for other valid ways of characterizing God in other scriptures and in other languages. In this case, Panipati is suggesting that the Hindu deities and the Hindu avatars, including Ganesha, Saraswati, Rama, etc., are also among the names of God. And just to, in case anyone doesn't know, the notion of an avatara, we could say a divine descent, right? The idea that it's a Hindu notion, of course, the idea that a deity, usually Vishnu, is usually the one who takes a divine birth, a divine form in the world, right? So Krishna is an avatara of Vishnu, Rama is an avatara of Vishnu, Vishnu descending into the world in some kind of embodied form. So here the avatars and the sort of other Hindu deities are being characterized as among the names of God, the divine names. Islamic thinkers in the Wahd al-Wujud tradition have tended to view the divine names as articulating the grand modes through which the human individual can relate to God. God himself, in his essence, is that, or Zat in Persian, in his essence, the divine is utterly transcendent and unknowable, and hence beyond any relationship with any other, right? Radically one, cannot relate to any other. According to these same thinkers, however, God chooses to manifest or disclose himself, tajalli, pedai, to disclose himself to creation, voluntarily assuming the various names and attributes as God's grand modes of relating to human beings and to the world. Accordingly, God is the Quranic name, the merciful, Ar-Rahman, insofar as he turns a merciful face toward creation. He is the Quranic name, the just, Al-Adl, insofar as he discloses his justice to the world, etc., etc. At any given moment, accordingly, a human individual, whether consciously or not, will always experience a relationship with God through some combination of these names. In his introductory comments here, Panipati is including the Hindu deities and avatars under this Quranic framework. A devotee who approaches Vishnu or Ganesha or Saraswati is hence simply relating to that particular, in this case Sanskritic, divine name, which is merely one aspect, dimension, or face of the absolute transcendent real. A devotee of a particular deity, however, experiences a unique attraction or special affinity for that particular face of the divine, which Panipati here translates into the Quranic terminology of choosing one of his names, choosing one of God's names, and, quote, remembering that name much. Here, Panipati is echoing dozens of exhortations in the Quran to, for instance, chapter 26, verse 227, remember God often, or remember God much, or to mention the names of one's Lord, right? This is, of course, all over the Quran. The operative word here being dhikr, or zikr, yad in Persian, right, to remember or to mention God's names. Hence, despite the countless formal differences that exist between the varieties of Islamic remembrance and piety versus the varieties of Hindu worship and contemplation, Panipati is nevertheless willing to assert that these both fall under the general Quranic concept of mentioning or invoking God's names, a notion that the translators will later correlate with the Hindu practice of japa. You may have heard of japa yoga, right? The repetition of divine names or mantras. Exactly how a devotee or a sage, a rishi, accomplishes this remembrance is, according to Panipati, laid out in the, quote, revered books, Kutubi Mu'tabere, of the Indians, a term that again has a strong Quranic resonance. Let me skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time. Panipati is here, seems to be, right, the Yoga Vasishta is not itself thought to be a revelation, right? It's not like the Quran, it's not God's speech. It's sort of an inspired scripture. So Panipati here seems to be using perhaps a grander notion of the word kitab than specifically a divine revelation. But we can talk more about that afterwards if anybody wants to. So we don't really have time to really fully dwell on this next passage. I think this is my last passage. But I'll just throw it up on the screen here, and I'm happy to come back to it later if there's time. But just this curious, really interesting, and really quite accurate description of a Hindu cosmology, a Hindu notion of time, the notion of the four yugas, right? The idea that every universe goes through these four yugas. The earlier yugas are time periods of sort of truth and virtue, and with every passing yuga, things get more chaotic, more evil, more unjust, more unstable. We are, of course, in the fourth yuga right now, the Kali Yuga. And then one cycle of yugas will then end and then start over again. And in Hindu cosmology, there is these vast cycles of yugas and mahayugas, universes being destroyed and then a new universe created. Here, I'll just say in brief, we don't have really time to dwell on it, but we have quite an accurate translation of the notion of the four yugas. Again, it's interesting that in this Persian text presented to a Mughal audience, presented to sort of learned Muslims, not only Muslims, it's of course a cosmopolitan audience, but presented to a Muslim audience in part. The notion of the Hindu yugas is here, it's translated quite accurately. It's allowed to stand on its own 2 feet. The Muslim translator, in other words, doesn't feel a need to explain things away that he's theologically uncomfortable with. Some translations do this. This particular translation does not. The Hindu notion is really allowed to be presented and to stand on its own 2 feet. Here, presumably, Panipati gives a little gloss to make it a little bit recognizable to Muslims. He refers to the Yom Ad-Din, like Yom Qiyamah, the day of resurrection. But that's actually doesn't explain anything. If anything, it only muddies up matters more. How does this notion of a cyclical, repeated existence line up with the notion of the day of resurrection? He just throws it out there and doesn't explain it to us. But he seems to be just sort of lightly suggesting like there's some kind of similarity here. But he doesn't allow that gesture to deform, so to speak, the Hindu teaching. Again, yugas are allowed to stand on their own terms. We can come back to that later if anybody wants to in the question and answer. I'll just point us down here to this bottom paragraph. The people of India say that in these four yugas, the absolute being and the light of the unseen, for the sake of improving the condition of the people of the world, out of its own will and generosity, manifests itself in the world through a special manifestation, Nasharikhas. One of these special manifestations is Narasimha, who is the half-man, half-lion form. The text goes on and on. Panipati goes from here to enumerate various Hindu deities and avatars as the distinct names and specifications of the real, including Shiva, Ganesha, Saraswati, Rama, Hanuman, and several others. Panipati then goes on to mention, quote, the book, the Veda, God's speech from his own mouth, which manifests a total and perfect manifestation. A few pages later, Panipati refers to the Vedas as books of Sharia, books of Shariat. And so the Veda itself, according to Panipati, is God's direct speech, the total and perfect book of Sharia, like the Quran. The Quran itself, and a great many thinkers in the Sufi tradition say so, make much of the Quranic insistence upon the multiplicity of revelations sent to multiple prophets in different languages. But these revelations in different languages nevertheless teach the same message and again, quote, confirm one another. The Quran says this multiple times. So the Quranic suggestion that any given instance of revelation is tailored to the unique needs of each community, of each ummah, is also very significant for thinkers like Panipati. Panipati echoes such sentiments in his introduction, even though he doesn't dwell on them. But the implicit idea seems to be that, the Vedas are a revelation, the Quran is a revelation, and the languages and even the Sharias, the the laws, you could say, of these two books are supposed to be different because they were revealed to two different societies, to two different collectivities with different needs and different ailments. So God's revealed books are tailored to the needs of the community that it's revealed to, and is of course spoken in the language of the community that it's revealed to. Nevertheless, to say the point once again, the truth expressed by every revelation is one and the same. So that's all for the text. Just to provide maybe some kind of an avenue forward for us to think about how to try to harness a pre-colonial thought like this for the purposes of the post-colonial. I can stop sharing this. Okay. I have a bit more time. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Right. Again, thinking in terms of religious studies, that's where I come from, and that's where I do my work. Religious studies has, of course, trying to reckon with its own imperialist and Orientalist legacy, how to move beyond that legacy. One frequently affirmed possibility is to, you could say, bring more civilizational epistemologies to the table, right? Religious studies as a discipline, it's born out of a Euro-American context. Overwhelmingly, its foundational categories and concepts come out of a kind of Euro-American canon. One way of maybe moving beyond this imperialist legacy is to bring other civilizational thought forms, you could say, to the table. What would it mean to really bring, say, an indigenous African philosopher to the table, not just as the object of study, but an actual fellow theorist and thinker? Or say, to take a Native American theory of ritual, not just as an object that we study, but as an actual theory, right? A lens with which to study religion. The classic fear in religious studies is what we might call the specter of theology. Religious studies in its origins as a discipline tried to carve itself out as hermetically sealed off from theology. Theology is what committed faithful people do. Religious studies in its origins wanted to say, no, we are neutral, we are secular, we study religion scientifically. Now that language has completely fallen by the wayside. People are well aware that these pretensions to objectivity are deeply, deeply flawed, but that legacy is still there, right? You will commonly still find to this day a knee-jerk reaction to, if we're bringing an African philosopher to the table, I mean, isn't that really just theology, right? And the ways that philosophy versus theology are demarcated is notoriously flimsy, right? So that's one big stumbling block in terms of trying to make pre-colonial, pre-modern resources relevant to the contemporary and to the post-colonial. Another kind of dichotomy or stumbling block in the discourse is the desire to be critical on the one hand versus what we might call a kind of liberal knee-jerk inclusivism on the other. Amy Hollywood, for instance, she articulates a notion of radical openness. Right? She reads medieval Christian thinkers and says, we as scholars should be radically open to being deeply existentially transformed by our encounter with these materials. Robert Orsi has his own version of this. Dipesh Chakrabarti has an important version of this in his well-regarded book, Provincializing Europe. My concern, and the concern of a number of people in the field, is that this language of being radically open might actually just be simply a re-inscribing of a kind of neoliberalism, a kind of re-inscribing of a particular kind of politics. Scholars like Russell McCutcheon, Bruce Lincoln, Aaron Hughes, Timothy Fitzgerald, they would say that this is part of just the ideology of religious studies. When you're saying you want to be radically open to an encounter with the other, you usually only mean that for certain radical others, right? You don't mean I want to be radically open to being transformed by ISIS. You don't mean I want to be open to being radically transformed by some kind of really conservative voice that you politically disagree with, right? No, so what's actually happening, the critique will be, is that there's this neoliberal umbrella, right? This kind of politics of kindness and tolerance and openness. And that actually dictates the terms with which these kinds of cross-cultural conversations can happen. So again, the sort of Euro-American Europhone narrative gets to be the kind of meta that sets the terms of the conversation. Just to take the pace Chakrabarti for a moment, since I mentioned him, again, a book I deeply, deeply appreciate. He pushes it further than almost anybody else in the discipline of history to try to put simultaneously on the table a sort of Europhone way of describing some historical phenomenon, but putting that alongside a more indigenous way of telling that history through their lens and their assumptions and their vision of the world. You know, in the book, throughout the book, he sort of will give one version of it that he calls History 1 and another version of it that he calls History 2. Again, I appreciate the effort immensely, but nevertheless, you can see moments in the book where the umbrella that's dictating the whole discourse is a deeply Europhone one, right? He has phrases in the book, for instance, that he says the whole effort, the whole book is animated by the spirit of the subaltern intervention, which he describes in Europhone terms of a pursuit of social justice on the one hand and the democratic project on the other. I'm not saying anything about whether these are good or bad things, but my point is just, right, the foundational motivations of the project are Europhone ones, not ones that are pulled out of a pre-modern heritage. So in brief, if we're to take our lead from, right, really try to take seriously the possibility of learning from the other, my suggestion is, what happens if we try to take the lead of these three translators, for instance, right? In this translation of the Log-Yoga Vasishta, we have three scholars, two Hindu Pandits and one Muslim, who come from discrete worlds, right? The sort of Islamic philosophical tradition and the Hindu philosophical tradition. They came of age in isolation from one another, right? They're separate entities now coming together rather recently as mature traditions. And these translators are facing the challenge of trying to forge a conversation between these two intellectual worlds. Right? And we see in their strategies and their translation techniques, their attempt to make that conversation happen. So my proposal, my humble proposal is, that's what we're trying to do right now, create such conversations. Let's try to learn from how they crafted theirs. And I'll end with this. The first lesson that I think we take away, my apologies. The first lesson that we take away from these translators is the first place they pay attention to is the realm of metaphysics, right? The first thing that they want to get clear is what is real according to the Islamic tradition and according to the Hindu tradition. Not just what is real before us in material reality, but what's real ultimately. That's where their interest gravitates immediately, right? You see it right there in the introduction. This is not the way that we tend to do things, at least in contemporary religious studies, right? Religious studies is overwhelmingly averse to normative questions of truth, right? That's not really something that you can do as an academic. Maybe if you're a theologian, I'll just speak for North America here, Christians tend to get a pass. It's easy to be a Christian theologian in the academy. It's still difficult for a Muslim to be a theologian in the North American academy, which is already one thing. The other thing is that they'll be labeled a theologian, which again still carries this baggage of, okay, that's something different. It's not really rigorous. It's not really academic. That old holdover of the origins of religious studies is still there, kind of taking such theological attempts down a peg. So that's the first lesson I would say we should learn from these individuals. Let's focus again on metaphysics. Right? They crafted their conversation. I could point to other moments of such dialogue fashioning in the pre-modern world. It's pretty common, immensely common, to see this emphasis on metaphysics. Is our own attempt to craft a dialogue doomed if we don't also take metaphysics seriously? How we might try to learn from these pre-modern translators in this way, I could see it taking two broad forms in the contemporary academy. One would be, I guess, if we want to take metaphysics seriously, a kind of expanded philosophy of religion, you could say. Um, this version of trying to take these translators seriously would give in more to current paradigms, right? The philosophy of religion continues to have a notion of things have to be rational, which means not theological. But maybe these translators could work with that. There's a long heritage of Islamic philosophy, of Hindu philosophy, thinking deeply about philosophical questions in ways that don't really presume any faith commitments. Really, really sophisticated, rigorous, rational philosophical inquiries into a number of questions, metaphysics, epistemology, logic, what have you, that really only presume that one's readers are, in some general way, committed to reason and rational argumentation. Maybe that's one way we could try to harness the pre-modern heritage. There's a plethora of untapped resources that have not been brought to the table of philosophy of religion because of a enduring Eurocentrism. I'm a little bit wary of this way forward. I'm not sure that the academy is ready to, right? One of the benefits of this neoliberal umbrella is that it has shielded, let's just say, Islamic history from immediate critique, right? In the era of imperialism and colonialism, there was an immediate knee-jerk, free-standing ability to just say, it's savagery, it's barbarism, it's backwards, right? A great benefit of the neoliberal umbrella is to shield Islamic history, at least superficially, from that kind of critique. This proposal that I'm suggesting would sort of reopen those gates, right? Okay, let's assume that Muslims are rational. Let's wrestle with their philosophies. Are we really at a place where that's going to be an unbiased endeavor, unbiased by a kind of prevailing Eurocentrism? I'm really not so sure. This is my last point. Sorry for going on a bit. The second way in which I could imagine us trying to take the lead of our three translators in order to craft this kind of dialogue. So numerous of the people involved in these Sanskrit to Persian translations were philosophers in their own right. They wrote rational treatises full of argumentation, what have you. Something that is continuingly fascinating to me is that when these same people who, when they're writing for their own tradition, adopt a rationalist mode, when they are trying to make sense of the other, in this time period, early modern period, the Mughal period, we find scholars routinely reverting to a poetic mode, a literary mode, an imaginative mode, right? People who in most of their other scholarship are rationalist arguers. When they're making sense of the other, they're suddenly quoting poetry. They're suddenly using a language of imagination. For reasons that I'm happy to talk more about, but don't have time right now, there seems to be this sense that bridge building or conversation starting is better done through a language, through a lens of literature, a lens of imagination. I can't begin to imagine how we could try to learn from that in the context of modern academia. But again, if we're really serious about trying to take the pre-modern seriously, to take the other seriously, we have to reckon with it, reflect with it, wrestle with it. What would an imaginative conversation between civilizations look like in the context of modern scholarship? So I'm just going to leave those few pointers there, and hope that provokes thoughts for all of you, and I'd be interested in learning from what everybody thinks. Thank you.
Oh my God, I'm about to start weeping. That was really so beautiful and so provocative. I have 100 questions. I also feel remarkable spiritual peace after listening to that talk. It's really an event for me. Thank you so much for that marvelous talk. There are so many questions, but I wanted to start off with a thought and see what you think about that. Contrary to the kinds of literate or secular conceptions, or even sometimes academic conceptions of Muslims and Muslim societies, I've been struck again and again by the fact that, amongst the popular classes, because this is one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, is, or I would ask you to elaborate on, that it, what you have said might lend itself to people thinking, oh, these are elite projects, right? But I'm really struck by the fact that, amongst the hadiths that are commonly known by people, right? Just I'm talking about the popular classes, not talking about literate people. Yeah, I'm talking about the popular classes. Amongst the hadiths that are known, one of the most popularly known hadiths in this region, at least, yeah, is that there were, the Prophet said that there were 124,000 prophets. Yeah, 124,000 prophets. So what you have told us is not just the pre-colonial past. In fact, for the popular classes, because a lot of the problems that we talk about in the academy are really our problems, the problems of literate people.
Right.
Yeah. And the other problem is that modernity makes us think that you're constantly leaving the past behind. But of course, you can't leave the past behind. So in fact, what you have is a layered present. Yeah. So there are different, there are different forms of the past that continue to exist in the present, even if you as a literate person thinking with all these modern categories. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that you're absolutely right that this is a major epistemological block, this distinction between this really hard modern distinction between religion and philosophy. And of course, at the end, you've beautifully put in the third term, which is also thought to be something completely separate, which is literature. Yeah, for these pre-colonial peoples, it appears. Yeah, when we're talking about thoughtful people, intellectuals. Yeah, intellectual people, and of course, intellectual people. Everybody's. I mean, people exercise their intellect. Yeah, to the whatever extent, whatever resources that they have. So it's not just the elites. Yeah. So I'm going to follow up later, but could you respond to that first? Both the point about the extent to which this past is still available in the present, even if it's not, to us academics or to the literate bourgeoisie, really, or the middle classes, and then this other question. Anyway, could you respond to that, and then I'll come back.
Yes. Thank you again for, first of all, the very kind comments, and secondly for the wonderful questions and provocations. Yes, no, absolutely. It's part of the limitations of my language set. It's one of my great regrets that I didn't grow up with the vernacular the way that I would have were I raised in South Asia. But it's just a limitation of the archive I have access to that I'm somewhat restricted to elite projects. But no, there are an abundance of ways in which I would argue similar phenomena happen at the popular level, both historically and to this day. I watch from afar what's going on in India and Pakistan, and increasingly worried with every passing year, every passing month, whenever I have the chance to visit. And, I go into one of the old dargahs that I've visited of old. I go into, one of the old khankas or shrines. I see that same old pre-modern, the perfume of the pre-modern world still somehow present there. I'm always worried it's disappearing, but I think it still survives in these spaces and in these places. I'm often, I'll say, annoyed by a kind of assumption in a lot of scholarship that non-literate people, non-elite people, they're just not very thoughtful when it comes to such interactions. I think there's far greater intelligence in these places, in these spaces, in these populations than they're usually given credit for. And it's part of the double-edged sword, I think, of the intervention that that I began my talk with, to say that it's not really about religion. It's more about the quotidian, the everyday. It's more about politics and navigating social things. I think that kind of lens tends to erase all the thinking that's going on among non-elite, non-literate classes and spaces and peoples. I look at the poetry of someone like Bulleh Shah, right? You know, you're not likely to find a more beloved vernacular figure. His poetry is so intelligent. There is so much learning there. This individual knows his theology. He knows his Quran. He's not just in some kind of because of he's influenced by his environment, and that's why he feels like he can talk about Krishna's flute, or he can talk about Hiranja, or something like that. Right? There's often a kind of assumption to say that this is, they absorb their environment, and oh, they don't know any better. Right? This is just the way that they speak. I read Bulleh Shah as having very sophisticated and intelligent thoughts on these things. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He has very clear thoughts when he is making use of Krishna's flute. And I misspoke, but I think he has in mind Rumi's flute. I think he has in mind a whole long heritage, and there's immense learning and thinking and reflection behind his literature. Now, the extent to which any given, let's say, contemporary lover of Bulleh Shah's lyrics is having the same thoughts, that's only going to happen in conversation with that person. Again, my inclination is to say that there's a great deal more intelligence and reflection there than people usually recognize. But does that answer your question? Or
yeah, I don't think it's as much a question of intelligence. I think it's a question of temperament. I think in fact, the literate classes project their own lack of a philosophical temperament onto, and even academics. Yeah. So if you do philosophy, you're doing something special. Whereas for, I think, most people, the popular classes, it's just the most natural kind of activity. That's one of the things you do as a human being, is to inquire about being and about reality, about truth.
right.
These are, of course, these are not acceptable in an academic environment. These are not acceptable existential projects. Yeah. Even in terms of the ontological turn. So my own training was in anthropology, and just a while back I excitedly picked up this new text. It was called The Anthropological Turn, and then not very far into the introduction, I was told by the authors that despite the fact that they were going to explore these different ontologies, we would not abandon whatever it is that our own ontology is supposed to be, that we wouldn't go native, as it were. Yeah? But really, so I think, it's really a question of the philosophical temperament of modern people themselves. After all, the modern age is, despite the fact that, we read all these philosophical texts, is a massive abandonment of philosophy. Yeah. Tocqueville himself, when America, which dominates so much, the modern period, Tocqueville himself said, that the Americans are the most anti-philosophical or non-philosophical people that have ever existed. Yeah. And you can see that, in our general culture. So, and in terms of, so I want you to also tell us something a little bit more about the distinction about Bakhtin points out that in fact in the pre-modern period, there's more circulation between the elite and the popular classes.
Right.
Yeah. Right. There's more circulation between the elite and the popular classes. So for example, some of the philosophical concepts that you were talking about, like Wadat al-Wujud, for instance,
right.
Khaja Ghulam Farid, who dies in 1901 and whose poetry is sung, etc. Even Coke Studio has that Husn Hakiki,
right.
which Shahab Ahmed actually also writes about. He writes about that particular
right.
by Khaja Ghulam Farid, Husn Hakiki. He uses, Wujude Matlaq, etc. These philosophical concepts, which are obviously known to the popular classes. So it's really, it's the literate classes who, this is their problem. It's not a problem of the popular classes or for general Islam. I think, even so, despite the extraordinary assault upon their life world and upon their thought world, I think a lot of people are still very philosophically oriented.
Right. Yes, yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and I was using the word intelligent, yeah, in I think a misleading way. What I think I meant to say is that non-elite, non-literate, let's say, consumers of this literature, of this poetry, of this music, they're not unreflective and they're not undeliberate, right? I think that was the way I meant it to be. Right? There's often an assumption that they're just passively sort of absorbing their environment, which is of course an Indic environment, and so right, despite themselves, they in an unaware way, right? You have these Muslims who are using words like avatara, or they're using words like wujud-e mutlaq, and they don't really know what it means, right? So when I was saying intelligence earlier, I think what I meant to say is it is not as passive as it's usually thought to be. It's not as unreflective as it's usually thought to be. I would insist on that strongly, which I think is to your point. Yeah.
So there are lots of questions from the audience, but before I go there, I wanted to ask you, actually, why don't I take up some of these questions? I've had my time, and it's important that we get. So you can see in the chat also, but I'll read out these questions, starting with Matt Melvin Kushki, professor. Fabulous talk, he says. Just a simple textual question, though connecting to history of science and hence the question of rationalism you so eloquently raised. Given the infinity of divine names as avatars and Jafar as a shared Mughal cosmopolitan imperial discipline, do you know of any contemporary Sanskrit or other manuals of magic similarly adapting these uses of the translated Quranic divine names, particularly in a mathematical talismanic context? That's his field, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Kushki. Thank you for listening, by the way. So, okay, specifically, so plenty, of course, of Sanskrit texts on their version of Jafar. No shortage in this period or earlier. But specifically Sanskrit texts on Jafar that make use of Quranic vocabulary or notion of divine names. I'm not aware of anything. I think one would find Persian texts that try to bring those two worlds together. But oh, here it is. I just saw it in the chat, so I can read it more carefully. All right, when he says contemporary Sanskrit, I assume he means contemporary to the early modern period rather than today. Yeah, I can't say this confidently, but I've not encountered any Sanskrit text that would do so. In generally, the Sanskrit world remains somewhat famously and frustratingly for modern scholars closed off from a lot of these sorts of transformations. And it's something that I do at greater length in the book, where I'm looking not just at the sort of Persian world, but also the Arabic and Sanskrit world in South Asia. Arabic and Sanskrit writing remain relatively unimpacted by these kinds of cross-fertilizations. And as part of my argument in the book that Arabic and Sanskrit have reached such a level of immense complexity and a kind of weight of tradition, the terms of those disciplines have long since been set. And so my argument in the book, my larger argument in the book is that Arabic writing and Sanskrit writing don't have the kind of youthful plasticity, you could say, available to them to really be media to vehicle these kinds of cross-fertilizations. Persian, in contrast, does have that kind of flexibility. Persian, of course, has a very, very long heritage, but as a sort of technical scholastic language, I'm oversimplifying, but as a technical scholastic language, Persian still does have that flexibility. And so I think it made good sense that it would be in Persian that these sorts of cross-fertilizations would be able to be discussed and talked about and instantiated. So actually in Sanskrit, I would be frankly surprised if we found a great deal of it. I think we might find Sanskrit texts with Persian marginal comments, perhaps. That I wouldn't be so surprised if we find sort of Persian marginal comments or commentaries reading a Sanskrit text that make these sorts of connections that Matthew is pointing to. But in Sanskrit, I'm not aware of any, and I would furthermore be very surprised to find it.
Thank you. So, Shankar, I wanted to ask you also, because I mean it's important, especially given the fact that I'm sitting here in Pakistan, that what you, I mean, the concept of Wadat al-Wujud. I'm sure you're aware that in Pakistan, for instance, the more sort of hegemonic narrative runs that there is this conflict in the medieval period between Wahdat al-Wujud, Ibn al-Arabi's, which is associated with Ibn al-Arabi. I mean, how appropriately, that's another question, and how are we to read that, that's another question. But on the other hand, there's this antagonistic ontology, you might say, an antagonistic philosophy or an antagonistic theology, philosophical theology, which obviously also has a political philosophical meanings between Wadat al-Wujud and Wadat al-Shuhud. And they have this narrative that in opposition to Ibn al-Arabi's legacy, there is this other sort of line that runs from Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi to Shah Waliullah, onwards to, I don't know, Maududi or some other contemporary inheritor, and maybe you can stick Ibn Taymiyyah somewhere in that legacy.
Why not? Right.
So it's not supposed to be all worked out properly, yeah.
Right.
But nevertheless, so yeah, what truth is there to that? That there is such an opposition. Please help us with that.
Yeah. Oh, you have opened up a can of worms. I have a lot to say on this. I'm very frustrated by this particular discourse, I've only tried to reconstruct certain small pieces historically, but to tentatively state what I think happened, let me just say immediately that we have barely begun to tap the archives. I mean, almost nobody has I could count on my hands the number of people who have seriously dived into the archives and tried to read all the relevant text and sort of make a timeline of the life of this particular debate. People have felt free to make broad, grand narratives about Wadat al-Wujud versus Wadat al-Shuhud without actually really reading much of anything. So let me say that first. But the parts of the archive that I have tapped into, oh my goodness, this is such an overblown debate in our modern contemporary imagination. Between Sirhindi and Waliullah, the overwhelming majority of moments that I find, speaking on this debate, deal with it in a couple of sentences. Honestly, it is not an animating central core question. In the decades, even century after Sirhindi, I routinely find major Muslim thinkers who are experts in exactly this kind of realm of ontology, utterly ignoring the question. They don't even feel the need to address Wadat al-Shuhud in the decades, if not century after Sirhindi came about. And sort of starting after that, you find people, okay, feeling some need to address it, but they do it in a sentence or two. And you routinely find very brief sort of solutions, many of them by fellow Naqshbandis. I mean, like in Sirhindi Silsila, who don't feel a particular need to say Sirhindi is right and Ibn Arabi is wrong. I mean, not at all. It'll just be sort of two sentences saying, usually, it amounts to the same thing. There's really no big difference between these two. The shuhud that's opposed to wujud is illegitimate, and wujud that's opposed to shuhud is sort of problematic. They disentangle it very briefly, and then tend to revert right back into the same old adjudications of waqt al-wujud, which predate Sir Hindi. So part of what I would want to say is that waqt al-shuhud, I don't think it becomes this sort of emblem of a fundamentally alternate ontology, certainly until post Waliullah. And really, I think in the 1800s, where the notion of Waqt al-Shuhud gets sort of latched onto and now made the handmaiden of a kind of national project or a kind of national identity. I do not see a vibrant life to Waqt al-Shuhud before that. Even in Waliullah himself, his sort of metaphysical and ontological treatises don't often get as much attention. But even there, for Waliullah, Waqt al-Shuhud is dealt with pretty briefly, more often than not. And then he jumps back into adjudicating Waqt al-Wujud, Jami's version of it versus Qaisari's version of it versus Qunawi's version of it. That's what's more interesting, and another part of the story which almost never gets discussed. Internal debates within Wahdat al-Wujud. We take it as a kind of reified category, which we treat it as though it's a kind of assumption that there's this kind of unanimity there. No. There are dozens of different versions and takes on what Wahdat al-Wujud means, and there's a kind of internal debate which occupies many, many more pages of the manuscripts. I'll put it that way. That's one thing which needs to be sort of reconstructed. The other thing that needs to be reconstructed is that the way Waqt al-Wujud is dealt with in modern writing, it tends to assume that the ontology of Waqt al-Wujud inevitably lines up with a certain politics, which is one of tolerance and understanding and pluralism. This is another thing that's just completely simplified and missed. You will find proponents of Waqt al-Wujud over the past 300 or 400 years of completely different political persuasions. You will find proponents of Waqt al-Wujud who are staunch Muslim supremacists, I'll put it that way. Islam has come and abrogated all the other religions. There is no need to study any of those. Modern scholars will routinely struggle with this, and there'll be like a sentence or two where they'll be like, oh, this was a moment where his kind of Muslim zeal got the better of him, and he's being inconsistent. I don't think they're being inconsistent at all. I think that that kind of politics could fully line up with that kind of ontology if you just give it a sort of remotely detailed reading. Waqt al-Wujud is not some kind of simplistic, oh, everything is one and difference doesn't matter. No. Waqt al-Wujud has a very sophisticated account of difference. Difference is rooted at a very, very basic level of the ontology. And so Waqt al-Wujud is not an ignoring of differences the way that it's usually interpreted to be. If you read it with even minimally philosophical eyes, you will see that sameness and difference pepper the entire ontology. And a simple ignoring of difference is a deeply flawed reading of Waqt al-Wujud in the hands of any kind of theologian or philosopher. I think Sir Hindi himself knew that, and Sir Hindi himself is actually deeply appreciative of Ibn Arabi, and really only feels the need to make a few correctives here and there. William Chittick even goes so far to say is that Sir Hindi should be viewed as a thinker within the Ibn Arabi tradition, right? Who's having certain disagreements the same way people often had certain disagreements. And so Hindi himself, I don't think is fundamentally opposed to Ibn Arabi in any way. He in fact recommends to his own disciples certain works of Ibn Arabi's that they should all read. So in Sir Hindi, and really for a whole period up until nationalism comes to dominate the discourse, this is just not a dichotomy at all, the way that we tend to make it out to be. Sorry, I know that took a really long time, but I have a lot to say on this subject.
No, thank you. That's all very, very useful information and insight. I wanted to ask, I'm missing Sajjad right now, but I wanted to ask you this. I wanted to ask you this philosophical question. So it's often struck me that a lot of these kinds of conceptual difficulties, shall we say, that people face today is because the concept of manifestation, what you were in that text that you were translating, tajalliyat, yeah, that's something that's particularly hard, it seems to me, for moderns to grasp. Yeah? It becomes more and more difficult to think manifestation, to think divinity and manifestation, actually, yeah, because the two are related. I mean, the moment you say divinity, it implies manifestation. It's not the same thing as saying God. The moment you say divinity, you get that little bit of tajalli, as it were, or it announces manifestation, to use a kind of Heideggerian way of talking about it. But why is that? Why? What? If I were to ask you a kind of philosophical, historical question, why is manifestation? I mean, I presume on the one hand, it has something to do with Protestantism and everything that implies. Yeah. I mean, modernity is overwhelmingly Protestant. Yeah. And to that extent, all of these other traditions. So, as a historian, as a philosophical thinker, and as a religious studies person, can you help me with that?
That's a good question. So the question is, why do moderns have such a hard time trying to?
Yeah, I mean, it seems maybe I'm wrong about that itself. Maybe that assumption itself is wrong. I'm open to that, but that's my hunch. Is that moderns that seems to me, when I observe that moderns have a particularly hard time with the very concept of tajalli, of manifestation. It's not a word you'll hear often. Yeah?
Right. Yeah, good question. I'm going to kind of hide behind my historian's hat and say I'm not qualified to speak about the modern, but let me try to answer it. If I were to try to hazard a guess, so on the one hand, I would say that it might be a kind of, it actually relates back in some level, I think, to the kind of split you alluded to earlier, and I'm going to take the opportunity to speak on it, to bring it back up, even though it's not directly your question. The kind of bifurcation you alluded to earlier, Professor Naqvi, between philosophy and literature. As you rightly suggested, I think it's right. These are very continuous worlds in the pre-modern context. I mean, almost, even going back much earlier, I mean, even Ibn Sina, even early in Islamic history, I mean, almost every great philosopher also wrote some poetry in the history of Islam. More often than not, that's the case. And so, yeah, the task of writing literature, a kind of medium that at least at some level is about addressing the world of the emotions, addressing the heart, addressing being, right? This is somehow complementary to or continuous with the business of philosophy, of intellectual, rational work. I would point to that kind of bifurcation as part of the problem here. And I'll talk about it in two ways. On the one hand, for the Ibn Arabi tradition, a notion of tajalli, it's spoken about, tajalli freely interacts with and intersects and cross-fertilizes with a language of presence in Ibn Arabi's hands and in the hands of the Ibn Arabi tradition. The manifestation of the divine is simultaneously a mode of divine presence. I think maybe it's the Protestant legacy, maybe the legacy of kind of rationalist cosmology, scientism, deism, what have you, a kind of increasingly mechanized vision of a systematic world. Deism inherently, right, or a mechanized notion of the world where God is completely absent, right? God is the clockmaker or what have you, right? To the extent that there's even an investment in putting God in the picture, God is just the sort of originary moment who sets the whole thing in motion. It's otherwise systematic and effectively devoid of the divine presence, right? We've become so habituated to just viewing the world in a spontaneous way, where we're habituated to viewing the world in terms of just processes, and presence makes no sense to us anymore. So Tajalli is pointing to the ambiguous status of any of God's creations, of any entity in the world. Ibn Arabi loves this language of any creation, any makhluk is he, not he, right? It is the divine and not the divine at the same time. Part of perceiving the divine in the world, perceiving the divine in creation, is a sensitivity to this kind of presence, right? Training your intellect and your being to be able to sense some window, some glimmer of the divine reality, of the divine presence here in the world, right? And it's usually literature, music, art that conveys the present side of it more effectively than rational scholastic philosophy, right? Philosophy is better for discriminating between things, saying this is not that, this is not that. Imagination and poetry and music is usually better for identifying things, saying this is in that and that is in this. But music for us is now, it's kind of a hobby. It's not something that we pursue in a sort of systematic way to cultivate ourselves, right? And so it's been kind of divorced from thought in I think crucial ways. Another angle I'll try to answer your question is, I guess, what you could call dichotomous thinking. Again, it points to the legacy of rationalism, but a formulation like he, not he, is kind of fundamentally unacceptable through a kind of rationalist lens. It's a violation of the law of non-contradiction, right? It's got to be X or not X. Those are the only options. So even thinking strictly through the mode of reason, you could say, that's just something that's difficult to come to grips with, even if we're taking music or poetry or presence out of the picture. The Ibn Arabi tradition is going to want to insist that even rationally, this isn't a contradiction. We see he, not he happening all the time. Ice both is and is not water, right? There's no contradiction here. So even strictly within a rationalist discourse, there's an attempt to say that this holds water. This isn't a contradiction here. But these sorts of options have long since fallen off the table of philosophy. So yeah, I hope that helps.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to talk about. You're exploring such absolutely essential and extraordinary, parts of inquiry. But let me, this is the last question I'll take. We're already over time, but this is such a great session. So Prashant asks, you argue in your essay and book, and here, I think this is Prashant Keshavmurthy. This is Professor Prashant Keshavmurthy from McGill. He's asking, you argue in your essay and book and here that poetry was central to Hindu and Muslim conceptions of each other. Do you think there was any kind of coincidence at play here between Perso-Arabic understandings of takhayyul and Sanskrit, perhaps even tantric understandings of bhavna?
Thank you, Prashant. Exalted audience that we have. I wasn't expecting that. Bhavana specifically. Let's see. That's a good question, and I've not thought of putting those two concepts together before. I'll say I haven't encountered it, though that statement should be qualified immediately by these aren't the sorts of texts that I usually read in my work. I'm trying to think if, all these sort of Arabo-Persian deployments of khayal, takhayyul, wahm, if Sanskrit notion of bhavana is somehow operative in the background. Nothing is coming to mind. So I'll just say, as Prashant, I think knows all too well already. So the more usual homology, the more usual Sanskritic language that is resorted to when something like khayal is discussed in a poetic literary mode is rasa, a notion like rasa. And Aditya Bhel would be the first person I would point audience members to read more about this. He's done some lovely, lovely work on the Premakyanas, Hindavi Premakyanas. That's the usual juxtaposition. Rasa, Sanskritic notions of rasa, of aesthetic relish, of the aesthetic appreciation of these kinds of heightened, aestheticized emotions. That's the direct Sanskritic Hindu world that Muslim Persian writers will plug into when they're trying to propose a kind of equivalence. Rasa it's part of the same universe, that discusses bhavana. I have not seen Persian writers making a particular deal out of bhavana in the particular. I don't see it as a term transliterated in text. I don't see it as a term that they're trying to define. But there's a lot more text to be read. So I'd love to see that link explicit in the archive. And I would be wide open to an argument that the way that Muslims are conceptualizing rasa is also sort of connected with the notion of bhavana sort of in the background. But I'd have to think more about it to say that more confidently. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Professor Shankar Nair. There are some excellent questions, and I'm really loath to close the conversation right now, given that there's an excellent question from one of our former students, Uzair Ibrahim, which will be there in the Facebook. So I encourage you, Uzair, to please write to Shankar, or Shankar, you can also see the questions which are not visible to you right now. After the program, you can see it on Facebook. On our website. So the questions will be available to you. And of course, Professor Shankar Nair's email address will be available at his website at the University of Virginia Religious Studies, Department of Religious Studies page. So there, especially, I encourage you to get in touch with Professor Shankar Nair. Thank you so much. This was such a great session. It's rare to feel hope these days, as you know. But what can I say? God bless you. You're such a pure soul. Thank you.
Oh, if I gave any hope to the world out there, then that's the highest compliment you could pay me. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Shankar Nair, and thank you to all our listeners. See you again in a couple of weeks. You can see the updates we will be posting of all the different talks that we have planned. Professor Sajjad Rizvi especially, and we planned for the rest of this semester, and we'll have lots of other talks as well. So please do join and keep abreast of what's happening with the Islam After Colonialism series. Thank you, and Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you again for the invitation.